Thank you for joining us for this important prevention and awareness training, part of a district-wide initiative to ensure that we, as LAUSD employees, understand our role in prevention and intervention when a student might be at risk for suicide.
All the information you will be learning today is important, so you will not be able to advance through the modules without viewing them completely. Within the training, you may navigate back to the beginning of the module using the previous button, or return to a previous module by clicking on the menu on the left side of your screen. You may turn on closed captioning using the CC button located on the lower right of the screen next to the volume button. During the course of training, you will be asked knowledge check questions that will require a response before you can move forward. This training will culminate with a series of assessment questions that will require a 100% correct response rating, followed by a prompt to save or print your certificate of completion. Lastly, you are watching this presentation in a separate window from MyPLN. The MyPLN main window must be kept open for the system to track your progress and completion. If you need to stop the training, select the pause button, close this window, and then close the MyPLN window to save your place in the course. Let's begin.
The California Education Code Section 215 requires school districts to implement a pupil suicide prevention policy for students in grades kindergarten through 12, ensure the implemented policy addresses students in vulnerable populations, which is discussed in Module 4, and provide training to district employees to increase awareness about suicide so we can work together in prevention. In this training, you will learn how to identify the risk factors and warning signs for students who may be exhibiting suicidal ideation or behavior. Learn about the various vulnerable student populations who are at increased risk for suicidal ideation, and understand the guidelines for responding to students who may be suicidal and/or engaging in self-injurious behaviors. This training is developed in large part from the guidelines and protocols established in Bulletin 2637, Suicide Prevention, Intervention, and Postvention, as well as information and recommendations from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, to name a few. For more detailed information, please refer to the References and Citations handout located in the Resources section of the course description. Module 1, Mental Health.
While most people, including most children, will likely adapt and recover well as we emerge from the pandemic, we know from previous research that for some, the mental health impacts of this trauma and distress will continue to have repercussions into the future. We need to be prepared to help those who need it in the coming months and years.
To understand the impact, let's talk about the continuum of mental health. On one end, an individual can be mentally well and healthy, while on the other extreme, an individual may be experiencing chronic mental illness. The indicators of where we are on the continuum can be evident in 3 areas of our lives: our ability to work or attend school, our ability to carry out daily activities such as eating, sleeping, or bathing, and our ability to engage in satisfying relationships. Mental health affects a person's thinking, emotional state, and behavior. It is important to note that at any given point, any of us can find ourselves along this continuum, depending on what is happening in our lives. In the Journal of Adolescent Health, Stark et al. Indicates that adolescence is a time of substantial change, marked by pronounced biological and cognitive development, along with significant reframing of one's social role and expectations. Resilience in handling life stressors becomes critical for this population, as suicidal behaviors in adolescence are significantly associated with suicidal behaviors in adulthood. In the United States, 1 in 5 youth ages 13 to 18 have or will have a serious mental illness. These numbers are also the same for adults. So think about the number of students in your classroom, your school, or that you work with. On average, 1 out of 5 will be struggling with mental illness. Furthermore, it's important to know that 90% of those who die by suicide had an underlying mental health condition. Therefore, when we recognize the warning signs and risk factors and get students the right help in a timely manner, then we can mitigate their risk and save lives. Being diagnosed with a mental health disorder does not imply living with this forever. Rather, with a proper treatment, which includes talk therapy and/or medication, individuals can and do get better. Let's take a look at a public service announcement that was submitted to the annual 2023 Directing Change Film Contest aimed at increasing awareness about mental health. Directing Change is an organization that aims to prevent suicide, reduce stigma and discrimination related to mental illness, and to promote the mental health and wellness of students through the medium of film, created, directed, and produced by students. This PSA tied for 3rd place in LA County. Congratulations to the students of Maywood Center for Enriched Studies.
Sometimes your feelings and thoughts scare you. Maybe no one seems to understand what you're going through. You might feel alone. I'm here to say you don't need to be afraid. I know it can be hard opening up to people, sharing your deepest thoughts. What if they think something is wrong with you? There's nothing bad about talking about your mental health. You don't need to feel ashamed or scared. In fact, by talking about your feelings or problems, it makes you brave. It makes you bold. It makes you empowered. So talk to a friend, a family member, a mental health professional, or call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Mental health matters because you matter.
Module 2, Understanding Suicide.
Suicide doesn't end the chances of life getting worse. It eliminates the possibility of it ever getting better.
To understand why people die by suicide and why so many others attempt to take their own lives, it is important to know about some of the common misconceptions about suicide and know the facts. Let's listen to some of the statements commonly made by others when talking about suicide and what the experts tell us.
People who talk about it won't really do it.
Actually, talking about suicide means they are exploring the idea, crying out for help, or possibly looking for encouragement. As employees of the district, whenever a student talks about suicide, it is important to respond immediately or as soon as practically possible by connecting them with the proper supports at school, such as a member of your school site crisis team.
If a person is determined to kill himself, nothing can be done to stop him.
Actually, most individuals who attempt suicide experience ambivalence, even in the last moments. They are in so much mental anguish that they do not see a way out. So anytime we become aware of a student who is thinking about suicide, remember, that is our opportunity to intervene.
Talking about suicide may give someone the idea.
Sometimes students make indirect comments such as, "The world would be better off without me," or, "I wish I could go to sleep and never wake up." It is important to explore what a student means by these comments, as they may be indications of hopelessness and despair. Talking about suicide with someone who is thinking about it already will not give them any ideas. And if they were not thinking about suicide to begin with, individuals will most often let you know that as well.
People who attempt suicide and do not die by suicide are just trying to get attention and are not really serious.
A non-fatal suicide attempt is an opportunity to intervene and get help for a student. They may be trying to get someone's attention because they need help. It is important to pay attention and connect the student with resources. We will talk about this later in the training.
Marked and sudden improvement in the mental state of an individual following a suicidal crisis or period of depression signifies that the suicide risk is over.
Suicide risk is highest in the first few weeks to months after a psychiatric hospitalization following a suicide attempt or ideations. It is important to monitor and manage individuals who have attempted suicide and ensure they are receiving the proper treatment, which may include medication, counseling, or a combination of both.
Talk therapy and medications don't work.
Treatment can work. One of the best ways to prevent suicide is by getting treatment for mental illnesses such as depression, bipolar disorder, and/or substance abuse, and learning ways to solve problems. Finding the right treatment can take some time and can greatly reduce the risk of suicide. Now that we have reviewed some of the common misconceptions, you may be wondering how prevalent suicide is in our country and state. Here are some numbers and facts. Nationally, suicide is the 12th leading cause of death amongst all ages. However, it is the second leading cause of death for youth between the ages of 10 to 14 and the third leading cause of death for youth ages 15 to 24. During 2021, approximately 22% of youth had seriously considered attempting suicide. 18% had made a suicide plan, 10% had made an attempt, and 3% had made a suicide attempt requiring medical treatment. In the state of California, one person dies by suicide every 2 hours. In LA County in 2019, there were 20 child deaths by suicide. Suicidal ideation is one of the most reported issue types for our schools in LA Unified. Suicide is a complex phenomenon. It does not have to do with an individual's willpower, and there is no simple explanation for any suicide. When talking and learning about suicide prevention, it is important to have clarity about definitions, as well as common language to use that will promote the destigmatization of mental illness. If we change the way we talk about suicide, we can begin to change the way we think about it, and hopefully, this will result in students getting the support they need so they can heal. Let's define the word suicide. Suicide is death caused by self-directed, injurious behavior with the intent to die. Sometimes there may be a precipitating event such as a breakup or a recent death of a loved one prior to the death by suicide. However, it is important to remember that suicide is a complex phenomenon that cannot be attributed to one single cause. In a suicidal state, thought processes become distorted. Suicidal individuals are not thinking clearly and are often in severe emotional and physical pain. Suicidal behavior is defined as actions that are fatal or non-fatal attempts to die by suicide. Suicidal behavior is the intentional injury to self associated with at least some level of intent, the development of a plan to die, or any other overt action or thought indicating intent to die. Sometimes when we hear others talk about suicide, whether it is in the media, the community, or even at work, we can inadvertently place value or judgment on an individual's suicidal behavior or ideations. This can further contribute to the stigmatization associated with accessing support and mental health services. Let's work together as a school community and use common language to talk about suicide accurately and without judgment. Rather than saying,
"He committed suicide,"
try saying,
He died by suicide.
the term committed implies a crime or an immoral act that has taken place, and suicide is no longer seen this way. By saying someone died by suicide, We are recognizing this to be the result of a mental health condition that could be medically treatable. Here are some other ways people talk about suicide that we should try to avoid. Statements such as,
She had a failed suicide attempt.
or,
There were 2 completed suicides last month.
if you begin to think of the terms failed, successful, or completed suicide, you will notice that the descriptor places judgment on the attempt. To say the word failed might imply a deficit in a person, while at the same time saying the word successful or completed implies something done well. Thus, it is advised not to add value to an attempt, but rather stick to the words non-fatal attempt or fatal attempt, such as,
He had a non-fatal suicide attempt.
knowledge check. Let's take a moment to do a quick check of what we have learned so far. Select the statements that are true and accurate about suicide. Standings. Module 3. Warning signs and risk factors for suicide.
Pain isn't always obvious, but most suicidal people show some signs that they are thinking about suicide. The signs may appear in conversations, through their actions, or in social media posts. Though the warning signs can be subtle, they are there. By recognizing these signs, you have the power to make a difference, the power to save a life.
There is no single cause for suicide. Suicide most often occurs when stressors exceed the current coping abilities of someone suffering from a mental health condition. However, it is important to note that most people who actively manage their mental health conditions lead fulfilling lives. Something to look out for when concerned that a person may be suicidal is a change in behavior or the presence of entirely new behaviors, especially if the new or changed behavior is related to a painful event, loss, or change. Most people who die by suicide exhibit one or more warning signs, either through what they say or what they do. As an LAUSD employee, you play a vital role in suicide prevention. Here is a list of warning signs a student may exhibit when thinking about suicide. Suicidal ideations or threats, including thoughts or ideas about ending their life. Significant changes in behavior, appearance, thoughts or feelings, including dramatic mood swings such as being extremely sad or angry, then exceedingly happy. Social withdrawal and isolation from friends, family, and the community. Suicide notes and plans that indicate an intent, a means, and a time frame. Self-injurious behaviors, including impulsive or reckless behaviors such as cutting, running into traffic, jumping from high places, or increased alcohol or drug use. Preoccupation with death, including talking, drawing, writing, posting, or thinking about death or stating they have no reason to live. Lastly, a significant warning sign also includes any previous attempts to die by suicide. Sometimes our students come to school having to contend with numerous other factors or situations that not only compromise their life functioning, but may result in elevated suicide risk. These factors include discrimination, traumatic life circumstances, stigma, familial and/or community rejection, mental illness, and isolation. Research indicates that suicide risk may increase when an individual experiences several risk factors at the same time. For example, bullying and victimization have been identified as the most common sources of stress for adolescents, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. It is also important to consider the role of social media and the messages our students might receive about suicide and self-injury. Internet searches and social media posts can be an indication that someone needs help. Many students may use social networking, such as TikTok and Snapchat, as an opportunity to express their thoughts about death, write about their own feelings, or search sites that may increase their risk for suicide. If you become aware that a student is expressing suicidal ideation or searching for content related to suicide online, it is important to work with your school's suicide threat prevention liaison or crisis team member to ensure the student is assessed, parents are notified, and the appropriate resources and linkages are made. Module 4: Vulnerable Student Populations.
I am an invisible man. I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids. I might even be said to possess a mind. I'm invisible, understand? Simply because people refuse to see me.
Vulnerable student populations are often unseen and, as a result, underserved. Students, especially those who confront systemic barriers, including students who face racism, are bereaved by suicide, and those who have unique learning needs, including English learners, students in special education, in foster care, students who are homeless, who identify as LGBTQ+, who experience human trafficking, and juvenile justice-involved youth, have faced significant adverse conditions during the pandemic, including rising mental health concerns. Let's take some time to learn about the specifics related to our students identified here. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and trauma. Traumatic events that occur in childhood, a subset of which are called adverse childhood experiences, can include family and community violence, incarceration of a family member, explicit and systemic racism, harassment due to sexual orientation or gender identity, and threat of immigration action, among others. Without buffering the effects of trauma, such experiences can create toxic stress that interferes with healthy development and creates lasting physical and mental impacts on an individual's well-being. Students with multiple adverse childhood and community experiences are at significantly greater risk for suicide. Up to 80% of childhood-adolescent suicide attempts may be attributed to ACEs. Those who have experienced 4 or more ACEs may be up to 12 times more likely to attempt suicide, and those with 7 or more ACEs are up to 51 times more likely to attempt suicide. Students bereaved by suicide. Studies show that those who have experienced the death of a loved one by suicide may be at increased risk for suicide themselves. The process by which exposure to a death by suicide increases suicidal behaviors is called suicide contagion. Guilt about a loved one's death, identification with the person who has died, as well as modeling of suicidal behaviors may play a role in contagion. The relative risk of suicide among 15 to 19-year-olds is 2 to 4 times greater among those who knew a peer who died by suicide. Additional supports should be given to those closest to the deceased, those who believe they may have neglected or mistreated the person that died. They may feel guilt themselves or be targeted and blamed by peers. For example, the romantic partner who just ended their relationship with the deceased. And lastly, support should be given to individuals experiencing depression, who have contemplated or attempted suicide in the past, or who have family members who died by or are at risk for suicide. Schools should communicate with other nearby schools and community mental health agencies to monitor whether there is an increase in suicide attempts or any pattern that would suggest a possible suicide pact or cluster. If this is a possibility, we strongly recommend involving experts who have experience dealing with suicide clusters in order to minimize the chance of secondary cases. Black and African American youth. Black is used as an inclusive term for those who identify as African American, Black, and as descendants of the African diaspora. Many Black youth are not identified for mental health services, even when they are suffering. In a report presented to Congress from the Congressional Black Caucus Emergency Task Force on Black Youth Suicide and Mental Health, Black youth suicide was identified as a crisis occurring in America. Within the last several years, there has been a significant increase in the suicide rates for Black youth compared to previous generations. As indicated in the graph, the suicide rate among Black youth has dramatically increased since 2014, faster than any other racial ethnic group. Preliminary risk analysis suggests that exposure to overt and systemic racism and lack of treatment for depression contribute to the increase of suicide rate among Black youth. Students with disabilities. In LA Unified, 11% of students have been identified as having a disability. Students identified with a disability may be at a higher risk for suicide than their general education peers. Limited data are available on suicide among people with disabilities. However, a recent survey highlighted that in 2021, adults with disabilities were 3 times more likely to report suicidal ideation in the past month compared to persons without disabilities. Prior research has also reported on increased mental distress among this group, which is a risk factor for suicide. Students in foster or out-of-home care. Children in foster care have experienced abuse, neglect, and other traumas, which can lead to physical and mental health challenges that may persist into adulthood. Youth involved in foster care or juvenile justice systems have a high prevalence of risk factors for suicide. Youth in foster care are 3 times more likely to significantly consider suicide, 4 times more likely to have made a suicide attempt in the past 12 months, and 5 times more likely to be hospitalized following a suicide attempt when compared to non-foster care youth. The rate of deaths by suicide for youth involved in the juvenile justice system is 4 times greater than the rate for youth in the general population. Students experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. Homeless is defined as individuals who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, including but not limited to those living in a shelter, transitional housing program, a vehicle, substandard housing, or living doubled up due to loss of housing stemming from financial loss. This also includes youth who are not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian, those who have run away from home, have been told to leave, or are pregnant or parenting and not living with their parents or guardians. There are approximately 4.2 million youth who experience homelessness in the United States each year. Suicide is the leading cause of death for homeless youth, with more than 70% reporting suicidal thoughts and around 50% having a history of suicide attempts. This means that homeless youth are 4 times more likely to have attempted suicide than non-homeless youth. LGBTQ+ homeless youth have even higher rates and are twice as likely to die by suicide as homeless heterosexual youth. Human trafficking and commercially sexually exploited children. Human trafficking is the unlawful act of transporting or coercing people in order to benefit from their work or service, typically in the form of forced labor or sexual exploitation. Commercial sexual exploitation of children and youth, CSEC, involves recruiting, harboring, or trafficking of a minor by force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Commercial sexual exploitation can involve prostitution, pornography, sex tourism, stripping, escort services, phone sex lines, and private parties. Children and youth who have been victims of commercial sexual exploitation often have significant mental health difficulties, including high rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and suicidal ideation. In a 2015 study surveying 107 human trafficking survivors across 12 U.S. cities, findings indicated that 42% attempted suicide while being trafficked, and 9 out of 10 trafficking victims suffered neurological symptoms and depression. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning, or LGBTQ+. Students who may be LGBTQ+, also show elevated risks for suicide and victimization compared to non-LGBTQ youth. LGBTQ+ youth are at 120% higher risk to be homeless than their peers, often due to family rejection, which demonstrates the intersectionality of the various vulnerable populations. Additionally, research indicates that in the past 12 months, 41% of LGBTQ youth reported seriously considering suicide, and 14% made a suicide attempt. Students with mental health disorders. The isolation, stress, and increased material hardships of the pandemic have strained the vulnerable mental health of California's young people. Major depressive episodes, MDEs, among youth have grown in recent years, but only about a third of youth with an MDE received treatment in 2019. In fact, about 90% of people who die by suicide have a mental health disorder at the time of their death. A key suicide risk factor is an undiagnosed or untreated mental health disorder, with depression, psychosis, and substance use disorders being the most prevalent. Substance misuse significantly increases the risk of suicide. It is often utilized as an attempt to cope with the various stressors that increase suicide risk. If a student is using or abusing substances, suicidal ideation should be considered and assessed for. Most adults are not trained to recognize the signs of serious mental health disorders in teens. Therefore, symptoms are often misinterpreted or attributed to normal adolescent mood swings, laziness, poor attitude, or immaturity. However, school staff play a pivotal role in recognizing warning signs and risk factors for students exhibiting suicidal ideations or behaviors and referring them to treatment that may reduce risk. The diagnosis of a mental health disorder should always be made by a qualified mental health professional. Students identified as newcomers or immigrant. In addition to the previously discussed adverse childhood experiences, foreign-born adolescents often experience stressors related to migration and acculturation, and recent studies demonstrate that they may be at higher risk of suicidal behavior as compared to the general population. Newcomer and immigrant youth can face many stressors, such as unaddressed or unidentified trauma, abuse, persecution or exploitation, mental health needs stemming from their countries of origin, the journey in adjusting to a new family structure, realities of reunification, fear of deportation, academic challenges, and cultural considerations. Recognizing the roles that relationships and environment play in adolescent lives, Stark et al. Reminds us that it is critical to understand how the school setting can support students and buffer the consequences of life stressors, including but not limited to acculturative stressors that take place within the school setting, such as bullying. A sense of school belonging, inclusion and membership, reciprocity in relationships with peers and staff, and feelings of support may serve as a protective factor against psychosocial distress for adolescents. School belonging has been shown to be negatively correlated with suicide ideation and attempts among adolescents, as well as positively correlated with academic achievement, mastery goal orientations, behavioral outcomes, and social-emotional outcomes. Schools can play a central role in promoting and enhancing adolescent resilience, particularly for adolescents in stressful life circumstance. When supporting students, consider the following. Create safe campuses that promote visibility, equity, and non-discrimination. Be affirming. Come from a place of openness. Do not make assumptions. Refrain from assuming a student's sexual orientation, gender identity, race, or immigration status, but do convey a welcoming attitude. Be aware of fear of disclosure. Students and families who belong to vulnerable populations may fear sharing certain information. Being guarded may be an attempt to protect themselves from additional trauma, rejection, or stigma. They may choose to disclose as trust and rapport are established. Be sensitive and patient throughout this process. Protect their privacy. Sexual orientation, gender identity, race, and immigration status are confidential information and can be shared only on a strict need-to-know basis. Never out LGBTQ+ students to anyone, including parents or guardians. Make referrals to the Suicide Threat Prevention Liaison or school site crisis team member for a suicide risk assessment as needed. Provide affirming school and community resources that support a sense of belonging. Knowledge check. Select each item that would be considered a warning sign or risk factor for suicide. Module 5, Understanding Self-Injury.
Inflicting pain in order to release pain seems illogical. Self-harm is illogical, but I continued to do it because I needed a release. I needed to get the emotional pain out. I needed for it to have somewhere to go. And at the time, nothing else seemed to provide that.
Self-injury is the deliberate act of harming one's own body through means such as cutting or burning. Self-injury is an unhealthy way to cope with emotional pain, intense anger or frustration, or to manage stressors. Although this behavior often lacks suicidal intent, it can increase the risk of suicide because of the emotional problems that trigger self-injury. It can also be used as a way to bond with peers or peer groups. Therefore, it is important for students who engage in self-injurious behaviors to be assessed for suicide risk. Signs and symptoms of self-injury include frequent or unexplained bruises, scars, cuts, or burns, consistent physical injury through provocation of fights, putting oneself in harm's way, hitting inanimate objects, for example, walls, lockers, doors, with the intent to self-harm. Consistent inappropriate use of clothing to conceal wounds, such as long sleeves or turtlenecks, especially in hot weather, or wearing bracelets to cover the wrists. Unwillingness to participate in activities that require less body coverage, for example, swimming, or not wanting to change clothing for physical education. Possession of sharp objects such as razor blades, shards of glass, or thumbtacks. Evidence of self-injury in various forms of communication, such as journals, drawings, or social networking sites. General signs of sadness, depression, social-emotional isolation, or disconnectedness. And making statements of helplessness, hopelessness, or worthlessness. Although self-injury can affect anyone of any age, there are certain risk factors that may increase the chance of someone engaging in self-injurious behavior, including the following. Age. Although individuals of all age groups may self-injure, Most people who engage in self-injurious behaviors are adolescents and young adults. Self-injury often starts in the early teen years, when emotions can be more volatile and teens face increasing peer pressure, loneliness, and conflicts with parents or other authority figures. Having friends who self-injure. Some students might engage in this behavior to bond with or emulate their peers. Psychosocial factors. This may include a student who suffers from abuse or social isolation. Mental health issues. Self-injury is also commonly associated with other mental health disorders, including depression, PTSD, substance abuse disorders, and eating disorders. Alcohol or drug abuse. People who often self-injure often do so while under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Self-injury can be a very difficult behavior to understand, which is why it is important that we pay attention to our reactions when we become aware that a student might be self-injurious. Some common emotional reactions adults, including parents and caregivers, might have when they learn this about their student or child include panic,
What am I supposed to do?
worry,
Are they going to be okay?
anger,
How could she do that to herself?
disgust,
Why would anyone do that to themselves?
or helplessness.
I don't know what to do.
Because self-injury can be used as a way to manage stressors, it is important to understand that our reactions or the negative reactions of parents or caregivers to the behavior can become an added stressor, thus increasing the self-injurious behavior. Therefore, when working with students who might be engaging in self-injurious behaviors, it is important to monitor your reaction towards the student so that you relay compassion and concern rather than shock or judgment. Make sure to seek support and refer the student to the identified school staff, as we will discuss in Module 6. Knowledge check. Select the statements that are true. Instead of reacting with shock or judgment, remember to monitor your reactions to relay compassion and concern. This concludes Module 5, Understanding Self-Injury. Module 6, Guidelines for Responding to a Student in Crisis.
It's not one person that can stop a suicide. It's going to take a whole community, the workplace, schools, teachers, everyone getting together and making it okay to talk about it, making it okay to get rid of the silence. No matter where we live or what we do, every day, each of us has a role in preventing suicide. Our actions can make a difference.
In other words, youth suicide is a preventable public health problem. While our students might be dealing with difficulties in their lives, as district staff, we are in a prime position to recognize the warning signs of suicide, offer students a sense of safety and connectedness, and make the appropriate referrals for help. If a student discloses suicidal ideation or behaviors, the most important thing you can do is to take action immediately. Part of taking action is making sure you know who is on your school site crisis team or who your suicide threat prevention liaisons are at your school. Each year, school principals identify the members of the school site crisis team in your school's integrated safe school plan. One of the roles is that of the suicide threat prevention liaison, typically carried out by the administrator or designee and/or mental health professionals, such as a psychiatric social worker, PSA counselor, or school psychologist. If you are concerned about a student, refer them to your suicide threat prevention liaison. If the identified staff are unavailable, you can always connect the student with your school site administrator or designee. When you become aware that a student is suicidal or engaging in self-injurious behaviors, the key is to always ensure student safety by connecting them with support immediately or as soon as practically possible. For example, do not wait until the end of the day. Leave a note in the mailbox, send an email, or leave a voicemail message. It is important that you ensure the concerning information has been received and that someone is responding to the student. Secure the safety of the student and ensure they are sent to the office for an assessment accompanied by a staff member, not another student. Remember, as an employee of the district, it is important that you are working within the scope of your employment. This means that diagnosing or treating mental illness should be left to those who are specifically licensed and employed to do so. If you are wondering what happens when a referral is made, here's a snapshot. When you make the referral to the identified personnel, they will work with the student to assess for suicide risk, communicate with a parent or guardian, determine the appropriate action plan, which can include making a referral for mental health services or for a psychiatric evaluation, and develop a safety re-entry plan for the student as needed. As you can see, a lot happens after a referral is made, and one of the most important factors in helping the student recover and feel welcomed back is their connection with you and other adults at school. It is possible that you may be identified as a trusted adult on a student's safety plan. If so, there are several things you can do to be supportive, keep the student engaged, and help keep them safe. Remember, if a student selects you, then that student already knows you care about them. Having a trusted adult, not only at school, but also at home, is crucial to providing students with affirmation and understanding, and in the long run may encourage them to seek help in the future and stick with their treatment if needed. Additionally, there is an optional training that provides a more in-depth overview of supportive strategies called Protective Factors and Psychological First Aid, or PFA, for students, available on MyPLN. These 5 strategies of PFA, listen, protect, connect, model, and teach, can be used by all employees to assist students who might be in crisis or feeling suicidal. For example, you can listen to them without judgment, protect them by being responsive, connect them with resources or with a simple hello, model calm and optimistic behavior, and teach them self-help strategies. For more information regarding what you can do, including resources to share with the student, you can refer to the Trusted Adult handout located in the Resources section of the course description. To find the Protective Factors and PFA course, enter the following keywords in the search bar on the homepage of MyPLN: suicide prevention, protective factors, or PFA. Sometimes there are students you work with that may not necessarily be suicidal or self-injurious, but you are concerned about their social-emotional well-being. There is something you can do in these cases. LAUSD has wellness centers and clinics that offer mental health services for students at no cost. If there is a student you are concerned about and it is not an emergency, you can access the school referral on the school mental health website by typing smh.lausd.net in the address bar. Scroll down to Quick Links, then click on Wellness Centers and Referral Forms. You will find that referral forms can be completed by parents, guardians, school staff, or students may also self-refer. When in doubt, always refer the student to the Suicide Threat Prevention Liaison or Crisis Team member. In review, there are things you can continue to do on a daily basis to prevent suicide and reduce the stigma of accessing mental health services. Keep the warning signs and risk factors in mind and take action immediately. Use the correct language when you are talking about suicide. Remember, the reasons that people die by suicide are complex and cannot be attributed to one single cause. And you can always refer students for support in your schools to one of our clinics or wellness centers. Lastly, if you are not sure what next steps to take, you may reach out to your region's mental health team for additional support or contact the Student and Family Wellness Hotline for consultation at 213-241-3777. 3840 during regular school days, Monday through Friday, from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Whatever your role may be in the life of a student, thank you for being aware, supportive, and caring. Remember, being identified as a trusted adult for a student can be overwhelming. Your dedication to helping others requires that you prioritize your own self-care. Whether it is finding time to recharge, getting enough sleep, eating well, exercising the mind or body, or making healthy connections, it is important that you make time for yourself. For additional tips, refer to the backside of the Trusted Adult handout located in the Resources section of the course description. As we conclude, let's take a look at a public service announcement that was submitted to the annual 2023 Directing Change Film Contest aimed at increasing awareness about suicide. This public service announcement was awarded first place in LA County. Congratulations to the students at John F. Kennedy High School.
Dear Charlie, I'm writing to you because I'm scared. I don't know how to explain myself. All I can say is that one day everything just felt worse. Every day I feel a little more empty inside, like there's no meaning to any of it. I try to pretend that everything's okay, but deep down I know it's not. Sometimes there are days that I wish I would go to sleep and never wake up, and I can't get certain thoughts out of my head. I'm scared. But I feel like I need to tell you all of this. Someone who will understand. Someone who can give me hope. Thank you for giving me hope. Best regards, your friend, Avery.
If you or someone you know needs help, call or text 988.
If you or someone you know is struggling with mental illness or suicidal ideation, there is help. If you are in a crisis and need to talk, contact the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by calling or texting 988 or by calling 800-273-8255. You can also text LA to 741-741 to reach someone on the crisis text line. If support is needed with domestic violence issues, contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-7233. Counselors are available to help 24 hours a day.
This concludes the annual Suicide Prevention and Awareness Training.
Please close this window using the X at the top of the screen and then proceed